In January of 2018, then first-term U.S. President Trump announced a slew of tariffs and trade barriers against several countries, including Canada, Mexico, and those in the European Union. The most significant of these new barriers and tariffs were enacted against China, though, as Trump had long claimed that China, the U.S.'s most important trade partner by many measures, was taking advantage of the U.S. market, a claim that economists tepidly backed in some particulars, as well some of the specifics, like those related to intellectual property theft on the part of China, which were pretty overt, the Chinese government fairly brazenly gobbling up IP and technology from U.S. companies that do business in the country before hobbling those U.S. interests on the Chinese market and then handing that IP and technology off to their own companies. While those claims are generally assumed to be true, claims about a trade deficit were less clear-cut. Most of those sorts of claims seem to be the result of a misunderstanding about how international trade works. That said, Trump had made a protectionist stance part of his platform, so he kicked off his administration by imposing a package of targeted tariffs against specific product categories from China, including things like solar panels and washing machines. Those were followed by more tariffs on steel and aluminum from a lot of countries, not just China, and this implementation of trade barriers between the U.S. and longtime trade partners, which had mostly enjoyed barrier-free trade up till that point, largely at least, kicked off a trade war, with the Trump administration announcing out of nowhere new tariffs or limitations, and the country on the pointy end of that new declaration announcing their own counter, usually tariffs on something the U.S. sells to their country, while in the background, both countries tried to negotiate new trade terms on the down low. There was a lot of tit-for-tatting in those first couple of years of the first Trump administration then, and they led to a lot of negotiations between the U.S. government and these foreign governments, which in turn led to the lifting of many such barriers. Though the weaponization of barriers continued, with the administration, for instance, announcing a tariff on all imports from Mexico until the Mexican government was able to halt all illegal immigration coming into the U.S. Negotiation ended that threat as well. But this early salvo upset a lot of the U.S.'s longtime allies, while also making it clear that Trump intended to open negotiations with these sorts of threats whenever possible, which had the knock-on effect of everyone taking the threats pretty seriously, as they were often incredibly dangerous to specific industries, while also taking them less seriously, because it was obvious they were intended to be a negotiating tactic. When Trump left office, a bunch of international relationships had been frayed and scarred by this approach to trade deals, and when Biden replaced him, he dropped most of the new tariffs against longtime allies, but kept most of the China tariffs in place, especially those related to green technologies like electric vehicles and semiconductors, the US-made versions of which were becoming a big focus for the Biden administration. The administration then went on to expand upon those tariffs against China in some cases. What I'd like to talk about today is how this approach to trade protectionism and negotiation has ballooned under the second Trump administration, and what a new threat against China by Trump might mean for how the relationship between these two countries evolves moving forward. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. I'm able to keep this show ad-free because of support from listeners like you. If you're finding value in what I'm doing here, consider becoming a paid supporter for the cost of a cup of coffee each month at letsknowthings.com. And as a thank you for your helping me keep this show solvent, you'll receive an additional bonus More Things episode each month. All right, let's get back to the show. Trump's second administration opened with an executive order that declared a national emergency, claiming that the Chinese were trafficking drugs, especially synthetic opioids like fentanyl, into the U.S., and that this allowed criminals to profit from destroying the lives of U.S. citizens. This declaration allowed him to unleash a flurry of tariffs against China, first imposing 10% tariffs on all Chinese imports, then increasing that to 20% in March of 2025. China retaliated, imposing tariffs of 15% on mostly U.S. energy products like coal and natural gas, and on some types of agricultural machines. while also engaging in some legal pressure against US companies like Google. They followed this up with tariffs against meat and dairy products and suspended US lumber import rights, while disallowing 3 US firms from selling soybeans to China. The US reciprocated, and China reciprocated back. There was a period of spiraling broad tariffs and import bans in mid-2025 between the US and China, which led to an aggregate baseline tariff on Chinese imports to the United States of 104%. Which was followed with an aggregate Chinese baseline tariff against US goods of 84%. The US then upped theirs to 145% against China, and China raised theirs against the US to 125%. Again, vital to understanding this spiral is that the Trump administration made pretty clear that they were doing this mostly as a negotiating tactic. There were claims that they could solve the US deficit by raising tariffs so high that the funds from those tariffs would pay off the country's debt, basically, but that is generally not considered to be realistic. Instead, the consensus view is that Trump likes to play negotiating hardball, likes to step into negotiations with the upper hand, being able to say, give me what I want and I'll reduce the pain you're experiencing, and this play against China was another attempt to make that kind of advantage stick. China, for its part, seemed like it was done with the posturing at that point. It announced, after its retaliatory tariffs reached 125%, that it would simply ignore all further increases on the US government's side, because the whole thing is just kind of a joke, and it's beneath them to keep playing this childish game. Not long after that, Trump announced that the tariffs against China would come down substantially, though not to zero. Trump said this was decided after discussions with China, though Chinese officials said that they had not been in contact with the Trump administration on this matter, which is something that seems to happen quite a bit with the Trump administration. During this period of spiraling trade barriers, China was able to establish better and more open trade agreements with other nations in Southeast Asia, including South Korea and Japan. They also opened up new markets across the European Union for their exports. China also reduced its U.S. Treasury holdings, reducing its exposure to the U.S. economy at a moment in which the U.S. government was betting big on policy that many economists considered to be ham-handed at best and completely nonsensical, delusional, or harmful at worst. During that spiral, before things cooled off, China also began applying protections on locally sourced and refined rare earths, which are a category of mineral that are vital for modern electronics and things like solar panels, batteries, semiconductors, that is, computer chips, and electric vehicles. China makes and owns the rights to the vast majority of the current global supply of these materials, mining about 70% of them and controlling about 90% of global processing for them. And cutting them off or even truncating their flow a bit is considered to be a huge strategic threat. The US has been slowly investing in alternative supplies for such things, but many of them are difficult or expensive to produce in the proper volume, and it'll likely be a decade or more before those alternative sources can be properly exploited, replacing the volume currently imported from China. Back in June, China granted permits to US businesses that would be allowed to import rare earths, but that supply remained tenuous, a bit of a counter to Trump's ongoing tariff threats that could seemingly arise out of nowhere, messing up everyone's plans. The Chinese seemed to want to leverage this supply in the same way, and keeping supplies truncated while issuing a few permits meant the flow could kind of continue, but could also be slowed or cut off again at a moment's notice, should they so desire. In early October, the Chinese government announced new curbs on the export of rare earths and related technologies, just 3 weeks before an end of October scheduled meeting between Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping. These new curbs further limited what could be imported to the United States, even if there were intermediary nations involved, and also tightened their grip on anything related to mining, smelting, recycling, and producing products like powerful magnets from such materials. It's worth mentioning here, too, that these sorts of materials are increasingly vital, not just for consumer goods, but for the production of high-tech military goods. If the US were to lose access to sufficient volumes of them, the US military would have a very hard time making missiles, replacing satellite components, building tanks and drones. It would give China a significant advantage, probably for years, in terms of upgrading and maintaining their military hardware and thus readiness. Despite that, And despite the US government's claims that it intended to replace Chinese sources of these materials, theoretically limiting Chinese leverage in these impending talks, progress in that department has been minimal so far. About $1 billion worth of investment in rare earths supply chains have been announced over the past year or so, but further investment is considered to be unlikely in the near future, and it will be a while before these investments pay off, if they ever do. Announcing such investments is not the same as breaking ground on new mines and production facilities. Shortly after that announcement by the Chinese, President Trump threatened to enforce a new 100% tariff on Chinese imports, beginning on November 1st, or potentially even sooner, raising tariff levels to just shy of what they were back in April of 2025, at the peak of that US-China trade protectionism threat spiral. He also said he didn't see any reason to meet with Xi if they were going to limit rare earths in this way, but later clarified that the meeting had not been canceled and said that he set the implementation date for that new threatened tariff rate to November 1st because that would give the Chinese the opportunity to back down on their new trade barriers before the two leaders chatted. Global markets, which are sometimes a good barometer for how informed folks think these sorts of negotiations will play out, have been relatively calm about all of this, though there have been some significant tumbles in the US market, including a recent drop of about 2.7% for the S&P 500, marking the worst day for the US market since April of 2025, when the tariff threats last reached this kind of peak. One stance that's become popular in trading circles over the past year, and this might be part of why markets have been relatively calm about all of this, is the so-called taco theory, which stands for Trump always chickens out. The idea being that Trump is never really serious about any of these threats. He just likes to talk a big game, in part because his audience likes it, and in part because that gives him the hope that the other side will feel threatened enough to give him what he wants during negotiations. But if they don't, he steps back from all his big talk and quietly gives in to the other side, especially if they have leverage. That seems to be what happens over and over and over again, and that might be the case here too. Some analysts are assuming, then, that that's what's happening, as evidenced by Trump's own statements about giving China the chance to de-escalate, giving them specific instructions for how to let things calm down, rather than making these threats and suggesting that they're permanent, or not giving the other side any rationale or explanation for why it's happening. There's a chance, though, that there's some truth to the opposing theory that this is actually part of a larger plan by the Trump administration to create a new trade war that's meant to dominate headlines and concerns for a while, maybe as far into the future as next year's elections, all of which is meant to conceal other efforts by the administration, like the military occupancy of American cities, and the administration's vehement objection to releasing the so-called Epstein files, which allegedly contain many references to Trump and other powerful people within his administration and elsewhere, which in turn would further connect Trump to a renowned pedophile. The Republican-controlled Congress has made a massive and unusual effort to keep those files from being released to the public, and Trump has become well known for saying and doing headline-grabbing things whenever something inconvenient for him starts to bubble up into the news. So while there is a chance this back and forth will end just before those upcoming trade talks, both sides taking their fingers off the trigger, as it were, in order to make a deal, there is also a chance elements of this will be spun into a larger continuing narrative, a war of sorts meant to dominate headlines and conceal other things that the administration would prefer to keep off the front page. The book I'd like to recommend today is called More Than Words: How to Think About Writing in the Age of AI by John Warner. I'm going to share the publisher-provided summary of this book, as I think it does a pretty good job of describing what it is. Quote, "In the age of artificial intelligence, drafting an essay is as simple as typing a prompt and pressing enter. What does this mean for the art of writing? According to longtime writing teacher John Warner, not very much. More Than Words argues that generative AI programs like ChatGPT not only can kill the student essay, but should, since these assignments don't challenge students to do the real work of writing. To Warner, writing is thinking, discovering your ideas while trying to capture them on a page, and feeling, grappling with what it fundamentally means to be human. The fact that we ask students to complete so many assignments that a machine could do is a sign that something has gone very wrong with writing instruction. More Than Words calls us to use AI as an opportunity to reckon with how we work with words and how all of us should rethink our relationship with writing. End quote. Now, if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of More Than Words by John Warner. Let's Know Things is a listener-supported show. I don't make any money from ads, only what listeners contribute by becoming paid supporters at letsknowthings.com. If you're not in the position to become a paid supporter at the moment, consider leaving a quick review wherever you get your pods. Those help get the show in front of more people and lend a hint of credibility to independently made shows like this one. A huge thanks in advance, whatever shape your support might take.